People passed him every day without slowing down. Some looked away, some pretended not to see him at all. To them, he was just part of the background, someone with nothing to offer. Someone who took but never gave. And after a while, he started to believe that too, that he had nothing of value. Nothing anyone would want, nothing worth noticing. He wasn't angry about it anymore, just tired. Tired of reaching out and being ignored. Tired of feeling smaller every time someone walked past him without a glance. He thought this was simply his place in the world, that some people are meant to receive and others are meant to give, and that he was never meant to be on the other side of that exchange. What he didn't realize was that this single belief was shaping every interaction, every outcome, every door that stayed closed. And it would take just one uncomfortable moment to challenge it. One question he wasn't ready to hear. A question that would quietly dismantle everything he thought he knew about himself. And when it finally sank in, it didn't just change how others saw him. It changed who he believed he was. That was the moment it finally clicked. For a long time, he survived by doing the only thing he believed he could do. He waited. He reached out his hand. And he hoped. Sometimes people gave a little. Most of the time, they didn't. And every rejection quietly confirmed what he already believed about himself, that he had nothing to offer. That he was only there to receive whatever scraps others were willing to give. One day, as he stood in the same place he always did, he noticed someone different approaching. Well-dressed, confident, moving with purpose. Instinctively, he reached out, expecting the same brief exchange he had lived through countless times before. But instead of ignoring him or offering spare change, the man stopped. He looked at him for a moment, not with pity, but with curiosity. Then he asked a simple question that caught him completely off guard. "What do you give back?" The words landed heavier than he expected. He didn't understand at first. He had never thought about it that way. He stumbled over his response, explaining that he had nothing to give. That taking was the only way he knew how to survive. The man listened quietly, then said something that stayed with him long after the moment passed. "If you believe you have nothing to give, you'll always be treated that way." Without waiting for a reply, the man walked away, leaving him standing there with a thought he couldn't shake. For the rest of the day, the question followed him. What do you give back? It echoed in his mind, uncomfortable and persistent. And for the first time, he began to wonder if the problem wasn't his circumstances at all, but the way he had been seeing himself every single day. That question didn't leave him when the moment ended. It followed him long after the crowd moved on, long after the noise faded. What do you give back? He tried to dismiss it at first. It felt unfair, almost insulting. He replayed the scene in his head, searching for a way to prove it wrong. But the more he thought about it, the harder it became to ignore. Every interaction he could remember suddenly looked different. Every time he reached out his hand, he was asking for something, while quietly believing he had nothing to offer in return. And maybe people sensed that. Maybe they weren't rejecting him. Maybe they were responding to the way he saw himself. That thought unsettled him. It challenged something deeper than his circumstances. It challenged his identity. For the first time, he wondered whether the problem wasn't his situation, but the story he had been telling himself every day. The story that said he was only there to receive, that he had nothing of value. That belief had shaped how he stood, how he spoke, how he looked at others. And once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it. He didn't know what the answer was yet. He didn't know what he could possibly give, but one thing became clear. As long as he kept seeing himself as someone with nothing to offer, nothing around him was ever going to change. He didn't wake up the next day with a clear plan. There was no sudden confidence, no bold decision to reinvent himself. In fact, he felt more uncertain than ever. The question was still there, sitting quietly in the back of his mind. What do you give back? he looked around, searching for an answer, and realized how small his world had become. There was nothing dramatic he could offer, nothing impressive, nothing that felt worthy. But then he noticed something ordinary, something he had seen every day and never thought twice about. And for the first time, instead of asking what he didn't have, he asked a different question. What could I offer, even if it's small? He didn't commit to changing his life. He didn't promise himself anything. He simply tried one small thing. Not to impress anyone, not to prove a point, just to see what would happen. It felt awkward at first, almost uncomfortable, as if he were stepping outside a role he had been playing for far too long. Some people barely noticed. Some reacted without much thought. But a few responded differently. And that difference, subtle as it was, caught his attention. Nothing had changed on the surface, but something had shifted underneath. For the first time, he wasn't just waiting to receive, he was participating. And even though he didn't fully understand it yet, that small shift made the world feel slightly less distant, slightly more responsive than it ever had before. At first, he told himself it was coincidence, a fluke, nothing worth reading into. One small moment didn't mean anything, but then it happened again and again, not in big ways, not in ways anyone would call success, just small shifts in how people responded, a pause instead of indifference, a glance that lingered a second longer, a brief exchange that felt less one-sided than before. He tried not to get his hopes up. He had done that too many times in the past. Every time he expected change, disappointment followed. So he stayed cautious. He kept doing this small thing without telling himself a story about where it might lead. Still, something was clearly different. People weren't reacting to what he was asking for anymore. They were reacting to what he was offering. And that realization made him uneasy. Because if this was true, it meant the problem had never been the world. It meant it had been the way he showed up in it. That thought scared him more than comforted him. It took away the safety of believing nothing could change. It meant responsibility. It meant that continuing this small shift mattered. And for the first time, stopping felt less like relief, and more like going back to a place he no longer fit. It didn't happen all at once. There was no moment where everything suddenly worked. No clear line he could point to and say, "This is when my life changed." What happened was quieter than that. One day, as he repeated the same small action he had been doing, he realized something felt different. Not outside of him, but inside. He wasn't waiting anymore. Not for sympathy. Not for permission. Not for the world to give him something first. He was showing up with a quiet understanding that he had something to offer. Even if it was small, even if it didn't look impressive. And in that moment, it finally clicked. People weren't responding to what he asked for. They were responding to how he saw himself. He wasn't being treated differently because he was getting more. He was being treated differently because he no longer believed he had nothing to give. That belief had changed the way he stood, the way he spoke, the way he met other people's eyes. And once that shifted, everything else followed naturally. He didn't feel proud. He didn't feel victorious. He felt clear. Clear about who he was becoming. And clear about why the world had felt so close to him before. He understood then that nothing external had truly changed. What had changed was the story he carried about himself. And once that story shifted, returning to the old version of himself was no longer possible. Most people think change begins when life gives them more opportunities, more confidence, more proof that they deserve better. But sometimes change begins the other way around. It begins the moment someone stops seeing themselves as empty, someone waiting to be chosen, waiting to be given something before they can begin. Nothing about his world became easier overnight. People didn't suddenly become kinder. Life didn't magically open its doors. But he no longer stood in front of the world believing he had nothing to offer. And that made all the difference. Because once you stop asking who will give you something and start asking what you can bring, you are no longer stuck in the same place. You are already moving, even if it doesn't look like it yet. Most transformations don't announce themselves. They happen quietly in ordinary moments. When a belief shifts just enough to change how you show up. And once that happens, nothing looks the same again. That's how it starts. That's how lives begin to change. When something small, something uncomfortable finally clicks.